A Lively Experiment is a special presentation of the Rhode Island Committee for the Humanities and WJAR Channel 10, and is brought to you by Fleet National Bank and by your local Dodge dealer. Dodge, setting new standards of performance, and by Prego from Campbell's.
We, Charles II, King of England, do offer greetings to our well-beloved subjects inhabiting our island called Rhode Island, whereas it is much in their hearts to hold forth a lively experiment, that a most flourishing civil state may stand with full liberty in religious commitment. We, being willing to encourage the hopeful undertaking of our said loyal and loving subjects, do hereby grant this charter.
At my age, you appreciate a fire, even on a spring morning. Since I was driven from Massachusetts 30 years ago in the dead of winter, I don't think I've ever been completely warm. You won't know my face. No one has ever painted my portrait. Not when I founded this colony, nor served as its president, nor won its charter from the king. They didn't care then, they will hardly care now, when this is my only power. I am Roger Williams. The name might be familiar to you. I came here because of a very powerful conviction, which has never left me, that no man could be so sure of eternal truth that he dare impose it on the mind or spirit of other men. This is the soul's freedom. Every man in this colony is free to speak his mind about politics or religion, and they will enjoy that right as long as there is any strength left in this hand. This colony has always attracted men of strong opinion, of strong faith, men who are willing to pay the price of conscience.
Your own mother wouldn't recognize you now.
Good. Neither will the king's soldiers.
Do you have all the torches in your...
Shh, lads. Quiet. We have a long night ahead of us. It's their fear that makes them loud. His Majesty's custom ship, the Gaspee, has run aground out there. We plan to board her and burn her to the water. There have been acts of resistance in the colonies before, but none so sharp or so premeditated.
Hand me my rifle.
Be still, John. I'm coming. We are no mob of street boys. These are tradesmen and merchants, husbands and fathers, men who stand to lose everything if their part in tonight's work is known. But we can no longer write petitions and sit on our hands and await the king's pleasure. We have reckoned the price of this very carefully. And if we're called to account, let it not be said that there were no men in Rhode Island or Providence brave enough to act on their beliefs.
We were a distinguished band of raiders. Among us were some of the colony's leading citizens, men who had never before raised their hands in anger. We left the Gaspee a burning hulk, adrift off Namquid Point in Warwick, a full year before the Boston Tea Party. Throughout the Revolution and during the early years of the Republic, Men from Rhode Island were among the first to strike a blow for liberty. Nathaniel Greene left the comfort of his home in Coventry to serve as second in command for George Washington. He was a brilliant general who relied on strategy to keep the British on the run. Esek Hopkins was the first Commodore of the American Navy, and his brother, Stephen Hopkins, signed the Declaration of Independence. These men played leading roles in America's quest for freedom, and both came from Rhode Island. Yet, even after America had won her independence from England, certain inequities persisted. In the early 19th century in Rhode Island, every male citizen could vote if he owned land worth at least $134. That was fine if you were a farmer or one of the older established families. But if you were an immigrant, a laborer, or a mill worker in Rhode Island's rapidly expanding industrial towns, you felt the injustice keenly. A reform movement was led by a man named Thomas Dorr. He was eloquent and energetic, and by 1841, he and his followers set up their own convention and drew up a constitution which eliminated many of the old grievances. They elected a skeleton state government with Dorr as the people's governor. After an abortive attempt to storm the state armory, Dorr fled into exile in New York. But he soon returned to Rhode Island to meet with his followers.
Well, Dorr came back here to Acoats Hill, not to fight, but to legislate. He came back to convene a session of the People's Legislature that was scheduled for July the 4th of 1842. And he felt that if any force were employed against him, perhaps he could spot the approaching force from this hill, perhaps delay that force by fortifying the hill, and escape, as he eventually did, to the safety of nearby Connecticut.
The mere presence of Dorr in the state sent Governor King into a frenzy. The militia was summoned, and 2,500 armed troops, calling themselves the Law and Order Army, began a march on Acoats Hill. When Dorr realized the size of this force, he dismissed his men. The rebels fled, their party and their cause in disarray.
He believed in the legitimacy of the people's government. He believed in the cause of equal rights, and he was determined to put his principles into practice regardless of the personal consequences. And so he ended up being arrested and tried for treason and jailed for a year, and his political career and his political hopes dashed as a result of his commitment to principle.
In Rhode Island, there were other men who had few, if any, rights. The state's black population. The institution of slavery had a strong hold on Rhode Island in the 18th century. Newport was the center of the slave trade, and across the bay, on great plantations owned by the Narragansett planters, there were more slaves in proportion to the population than in any other northern state. But there was early and strong opposition to slavery. Roger Williams preached against it, and as early as 1650, several cities, including Providence and Warwick, abolished slavery. Rhode Island was one of the northern stations on the Underground Railroad, and in the mid-19th century, hundreds of slaves passed through Rhode Island or settled here. Elizabeth Buffum Chase sheltered runaway slaves in her Central Falls home. Chase also fought for the rights of women and working children, two groups orphaned by the rush of American progress. By the mid-19th century, Rhode Island had become an industrialized state. The textile industry had been launched here, and Rhode Island dominated the yarn and textile production of the nation. But the mill towns along the rivers, despite the efforts of their owners, had not lived up to their utopian promise. There was a new kind of servitude, more subtle than slavery, the hourly wage that bound men and women to their machines for 12 hours a day. In 1824, there had been a brief strike, the first ever in the textile industry, and the first to involve women. But the real upheaval, the crisis that forced men to choose between their livelihoods and what they felt was decent and right waited until the 20th century and the harrowing effects of the Depression. The Roosevelt administration battled the Depression with the National Recovery Act, but the burden of industrial reform and a deepening depression fell heavily and unfairly on the textile industry. By 1934, wages in Rhode Island's mills were almost half what they were in other industries, and on Labor Day, the United Textile Workers launched a nationwide strike. Picketing gave way to violence as mill workers battled police and deputy sheriffs hired by the mill owners. In Warren and Pawtucket, and finally in Salesville, large crowds of strikers were met by tear gas and bullets. With the appointment of a presidential board of inquiry, the disorders stopped, but the events of that fierce September signaled the emergence of a new power in Yankee Republican Rhode Island, an ethnic, urban working class who were to become the backbone of the state in the decades to come.
I spent my boyhood in London, the son of a merchant, in a world that smelled of coffee and cinnamon and that most seductive of fragrances, salt water. From the docks I watched as ship after ship loosed her chains, set sail, and disappeared over the horizon to a world I wanted to be a part of. And what did I become in this new world? A preacher, yes, but a trader and a farmer as well. For I know what it is to study, to preach, to be applauded, but I also know what it is to tug at an oar, to dig with a spade, to work and travel day and night. I know how much words weigh, but I also know the value of those who labor all day with a hand on the wheel.
Look at this board. Isn't it a beauty? This machine not only planes it, but it takes the warp completely out of it. See, this blade here is connected to... Sorry, I forgot my manners. My parents always said I cared more about machines than people. About animals, for that matter. That can be a real disadvantage growing up on a farm like I did. I was in Vermont. As soon as my younger brother got old enough to help out, I took off. Started walking south to find some place where I could learn about machines. Funny thing, too. Seems like every place I went, whether it was a small town or a big city like Hartford or Albany, the master machinist came from someplace in Rhode Island. More than likely learned his craft right here in this shop. This is Thomas Jenks' machine shop. I'm one of his apprentices. Figured I might as well learn from the best, right? In a minute. It's the mills that make it worthwhile to be a machinist here. There are dozens of them within a few miles of each other. Not only textile mills. Well, we make more cloth and thread than anywhere else in the States, you know that? Lots of others as well. Mills mean machinery, and machinery needs to be repaired and improved. That's what I'm learning now. Couldn't imagine being at a better place at a better time. And let me show you something else. This is a vernier caliper. Measures accurately to within 1/100 of an inch. A lot of these machines need parts to that tolerance. What's so great about this? Only that David Brown over at the Brown and Sharp Company invented it and a way to mass produce it. Or take this simple pointed screw. You know what these used to cost? Well, 2 years ago over at the American Screw Company, they invented a machine that turns these out by the thousands. I tell you, for someone with a head on his shoulders, willing to put his hands to a bit of wood or metal, this is the place to be. Seems like it's always been like that. From the very beginning, the colony seemed to have more than its share of skilled craftsmen and artisans. In the years before the American Revolution, 2 families of cabinet makers living in the Point section of Newport began to produce strikingly beautiful furniture in an original American style. The desks, chairs, and bureaus produced by the Townsends and Goddards of Newport are among the rarest and finest examples of American furniture. They passed their tools and the secrets of their trade on to their sons. John Stevens, a gifted colonial stonecutter, did the same. The shop he founded in Newport in 1705 still hand carves tombstones and also produces some of the most renowned architectural inscriptions in the country. But the real revolution in Rhode Island commercial life came from a material less durable than stone and more humble than fine furniture: cotton cloth. In the late 18th century, the Quaker merchant Moses Brown was continuing his attempts to establish a workable spinning mill, but the available machinery was crude and ineffective. Enter Samuel Slater, a shrewd and confident Englishman who had worked in several of the superior mills in Britain. In 1789, he and Moses Brown joined their talents and ambitions in Rhode Island. Slater rebuilt and modified the American machines, using not only his specialized knowledge, but the skills of local craftsmen and machinists. Within the next 10 years, Slater had designed and built several mills near Pawtucket. The production was automated and specialized, thereby producing simple goods in great quantities. The mill villages, with their schools, banks, and crowded housing, were little universes unto themselves. At their centers, the endless rhythm of the water wheels. For better or worse, Samuel Slater had created not just a new industry, but a new way of life. Another Rhode Islander was considered the mechanical genius of the mid-19th century, George H. Corliss. Slater had worked with water power, but Corliss's medium was steam.
Corliss had 68 patents in his lifetime, and he was considered the most eminent engineer of the day. He had the largest steam engine factory in the world by 1875, employing 3,000 people in Providence, and that was a very, very large operation indeed. Corliss engines were sometimes twice as efficient as engines that existed before. So here we go. First, emit some steam. In those days, Corliss had a really good bet because he could go to a mill owner and say, hey, I'll put a steam engine in your factory, and all you have to pay me is the savings that it gives you in coal. And he really made out.
But Corliss's greatest triumph lay ahead of him. A national committee asked him to help design a 14-acre hall of machinery at the nation's Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia. At the heart of the hall, Corliss placed his invention, a steam engine. But a steam engine like none that had ever been seen before. Built in Providence and shipped to Philadelphia on 71 railroad cars, it weighed 776 tons and could develop 2,500 horsepower. On opening day, dwarfed by the colossal engine above them, Corliss and President Grant set the machine in motion. The great engine turned, miles of shafting began to spin, and several hundred steel and iron machines, their power supplied by Corliss's engine, spun into life. Strong men, reported the New York Herald, were moved to tears of joy. By the end of the century, Providence was home to some of the biggest factories in the country. J.P. Coates in Pawtucket was the largest thread company in the nation, while Brown & Sharp had become an industrial giant with its development of accurate milling, cutting, and grinding machines. A company founded by Jabez Gorham before the Civil War grew into a giant manufacturing concern during the last half of the 19th century. Gorham Silver had assured its future by winning the contract to produce all of Tiffany's silverware. And by 1890, the company was not only turning out quantities of tableware, but also unique pieces of exceptional design and craftsmanship. A precision tool has its own functional beauty, but it is only an extension of the spirit of the man who uses it. With this elegant telescope and other instruments, a group of Rhode Islanders in the 18th century observed the passage of Venus across the sun's disk, an exercise that helped to determine the true scale of the solar system. The measurements that Benjamin West and others made of the transit of Venus can perhaps best be appreciated by someone whose own work like theirs, is a compound of intellectual curiosity, physical skill, and a love of precise machinery. Someone like Woody Spring, Rhode Island's first astronaut.
Probably the biggest thing our mission pointed out, and it's something most of us intuitively knew, but we couldn't prove it. Well, now we proved it, that people can go to orbit, and you can work very effectively, very efficiently, and you can handle very large masses, weights if you want to consider it that way, of thousands of pounds of Earth-type pounds, very satisfactorily on orbit. Well, folks told us that the view of the launch was really spectacular, since it was the second shuttle night launch that we've ever had, and we launched into a full moon, and everybody tells me it was beautiful, but it was pretty awesome from inside the cockpit too. One of our favorite pastimes when we're on orbit is to just go to the windows and just look down at the Earth. NASA's next step, the nation's next step, is to build a space station. From the space station, I mean, your imagination is as good as mine, but I think we'll be going to Mars, going to the moon, setting up permanent colonies. I don't think there's any limits to where we'll be going. We'll have to take small steps because we're still only men, but we're going.
In discovery, there is personal pride, and sometimes profit as well. But in the Rhode Island tradition, there is also the sense that innovation and invention should serve the larger interests of the community. A view best expressed by Zachariah Allen, another 19th century inventor and businessman, who said, "As social beings, we do not live for ourselves only, but mainly for posterity. We constitute the existing links of a chain that connects the past with the future."
I write every day. The page is like a great white ocean, and on it my pen plows a furrow like a ship. It is the first sight of deep water that sometimes fills me with doubt. I have a keen sense for the rhythms of language. My one gift, my ideal, is Horace, who plowed and planted during the day and wrote poetry at night. This life is but a short minute, and eternity follows. True art and music I enjoy, but I dread the day when life will be so easy that these colonies will be tempted by the diversions of dancing and theater. I prefer to entertain myself, for then I'm not surprised either by performer or audience.
Everybody, don't be late for dinner, it's a ragtime dance.
Oh, it's so good to be home. When I was in the choir at the Pond Street Baptist Church, I never thought I'd be singing here, downtown, at the Providence Opera House. I saw my mother and grandmother in the front row. I owe it all to Sissy, I mean Ciceretta, Madam Ciceretta Jones. This is her company. Black Patty's Troubadours, America's premier ragtime entertainers, the big novelty, the phenomenal success, the standard of merit. On the bill, I guess I come somewhere between novelty and success, between a ragtime piano and a vaudeville skit. It's what the audience wants, of course, although it's Ciceretta that people come to hear. No matter what she sings, when you first hear her voice, it makes you want to cry. It's got such power, such feeling. That's what the people respond to. Her whole life is in her voice. It hasn't been easy for her. Not that it's easy for anyone of color, of course. But Ciceretta hasn't forgotten who she is or where she came from. She has given dozens of black performers their first chance, and she came from right here in Providence. And even though she's traveled all over the world and sung for all the crowned heads of Europe and 2 presidents of the United States, she always loves to come back here to Providence.
Finale's in 5 minutes. I loved your last song, Miss Stewart. Nobody's ever sung it like that.
Thank you, Mr. Williams. Please tell Ciceretta I'll be right down. Audiences love the finale. Ciceretta and 40 singers performing a medley of American airs and selections from Italian opera. It is an exciting life. I only hope I can survive it. We've been traveling 45 weeks out of the last year, and Ciceretta's been doing that for almost 20 years. But that's what entertainment is all about, isn't it? And art too, I suppose. Excitement and hard work. The excitement is doing something that nobody has ever seen before. And the hard work, making something familiar seem new and fresh. Like this face.
2 minutes, Miss Stewart.
Making something new, even if you have to leave home to do it. You can always come back, can't you? Since the colonial period, Rhode Island's particular genius has been especially favorable to the artists, writers, and musicians who have lived or worked here. In this house, next to his father's snuff mill near Narragansett, Gilbert Stuart, the nation's first great portrait painter, was born in 1755. When George Washington set for him, both his expression and his false teeth were wooden, but Stuart finally coaxed a satisfactory portrait from the father of his country. Edward M. Bannister was the first African-American artist in the United States to win recognition as a significant painter. In 1876, he astounded the art establishment when one of his landscapes of a Rhode Island farm won the highest honor at the Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia. Against the wishes of her family and friends, Nancy Elizabeth Prophet studied art at the Rhode Island School of Design, and then in Paris in the 1920s. Alone, ill, and desperately poor, Prophet recorded in a remarkable diary both her fear and determination. Someday, people will realize that it is still possible to say something through sculpture, that a sculptor may yet live again. I am Providence, wrote Howard Phillips Lovecraft, and probably no writer is more closely associated with the city of his birth than this 20th century master of the macabre. He brought a new cosmic scale to the literature of the imagination. And his grave in Swan Point Cemetery is visited by admirers from around the world. In the 1920s, Brown University released upon the unsuspecting world two of the most original and iconoclastic minds in literature. In his stories and in scripts for movies like the Marx Brothers' Monkey Business, S.J. Perelman reinvented the English language, creating a world in which every entendre was double. Nathaniel West turned his more caustic pen to the corrosive effects of fame and celebrity in his novels, The Day of the Locust and Miss Lonely Hearts. A writer's words live on the page, but it takes a director and actors to breathe life into the bones of a play. Rhode Island is home to the Trinity Repertory Company, one of the country's most distinguished and innovative regional theaters. Under the artistic direction of Adrian Hall, Trinity Rep's productions are delightful and provocative, usually both at the same time.
Wait till you see what I got planned for the pageant this year. We're winners, dude, guaranteed. Oh, this is my best idea yet.
Offstage, the resident actors and actresses of the company take up their other roles as valued members of the Rhode Island community. In the past, theater played an even larger part in Rhode Island life. The vaudeville circuit was both home and proving ground for talented performers and promoters like Woonsocket's Eddie Dowling, who moved on from Providence musicals to produce Tennessee Williams' first successful play.
Providence was a very important theater town. It was on the main circuit, both for touring shows and for first-class vaudeville, which operated first out of Boston. So indeed, it was a very important theater town. During the teens, there were as many as 13 theaters downtown. There were 9 theaters operating on Westminster. It was our Rialto, our Broadway, if you will. Slowly but surely, film began to eat up the performers. In fact, one critic called early filmmakers the scavengers of the amusement business, because they were literally using up both the talent and, more importantly, the material of the talent.
A handful of early movies were actually made in Rhode Island, but in general, film production here was not at the level of sophistication of the other arts. In this 1930 venture, a sure-footed Roger Williams, looking for a home, appears to have wandered into an encampment of Sioux warriors. There was no help for it. If you wanted to be a star, you had to leave home.
Rosemary, I love you.
Nelson Eddy was born on Hartford Avenue in Providence. As a soloist with the Metropolitan Opera, Eddy was at one time the highest paid singer in the country. Then, between 1935 and 1942, he starred in a series of glossy MGM operettas opposite Jeanette MacDonald, earning the two stars the nickname America's Sweethearts. Warwick's James Woods, on the other hand, has specialized in playing characters who would have eaten Nelson Eddy for breakfast. In movies like The Onion Field, Against All Odds, and Salvador, Woods has earned critical acclaim for his direct and searing portrayal of the dark underside of contemporary life. Then there was Van Johnson, the Newport boy who went from Rogers High School to Broadway and then to Hollywood, where he became a star.
I'm very proud of my New England blood, and it was all this New England background that has held me in good stead and kept my feet on the ground, so that I've never gotten a swell head. My hat size is still the same as when I left Newport. When I was making a film with dear Judy Garland, Judy grabbed my hand and we pulled me off the stage, and I said, "What's the matter?" She said, "Look at those lights, they're all shaking. It's an earthquake." It was the first earthquake I was ever in, but I couldn't wait for the next one because I was going to get earthquakes in Rhode Island. I've made about 135 movies. No regrets. All my dreams came true. I couldn't ask for more.
But perhaps Rhode Island's greatest gift to the world of entertainment was the boy who was born in an attic room on Wickerton Street, George M. Cohan, America's most successful theatrical producer.
Thousands of his friends and neighbors at Providence, Rhode Island turn out to greet the grand old boy of Broadway with his greatest Broadway hit.
It's always a thrill to me to come back to my own town, even under ordinary circumstances. But on an occasion of this kind, a greeting of this kind, I'm just stumped, that's all. Over there, sing the word, over there. Let the eggs are coming, the eggs are coming.
Cohan had never been a singer, but the crowd forgave him this once. They wanted to believe that talent and ambition might take you anywhere, but that you could come home again.
We'll be over, we're coming over, and we'll come back.
The day that I was banished from Massachusetts, many watched me walk south into the forest and thought never to see me again. But they couldn't have known what an Eden I was exiled into. Some of these Puritan fathers are frightened by the wilderness. They're not happy until they have crisscrossed the forest with paths and roads. But they have not hunted with the Indians, nor paddled for 100 miles along the coast in a native canoe, as I have done. Of course, I couldn't manage that now. Last month, I rowed across the bay to Newport to dispute with some Quakers. I was almost too tired to argue when I arrived. Almost too tired, I said. During the journey back, even though my head was full of buzz and argument, I had my eyes on the shoreline and the sky. I felt that the bay and the woodlands were a gift, and the evening light a benediction.
Boom, 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 boom. Why are we here? Where are we going? It's time that we found out. Boom, 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 boom. We're not here to stay. We're on a short holiday. Boom, 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 boom. Life is just a bowl of cherries. So live and laugh at it all. Laugh at it all.
If you're headed to Roger Williams Park on a Sunday morning and you want to get a seat, you've got to get an early start.
It's a good thing we live near the end of the line.
I know that Tony would have liked to have gotten another hour's sleep.
Yeah, I would have liked to have gotten 3 more hours sleep.
But the kids were up at daybreak.
Elizabeth, please sit down. And Tommy, stop teasing your sister. You can't blame them. It's their one big outing of the week and they have so much energy to burn.
And I feel as if I don't have any left. This is my one day off from the factory, and we try to take the kids someplace different every Sunday. Someplace where I can relax.
And where I can see my friends and do something exciting.
Dad, can you stay for the band concert?
If you behave.
The band plays every night. And the last weekend we were there, over 10,000 people came to the concert. The park was packed. I know, dear. It was a very nice hat, and the man said he didn't mean to step on it. 2 weeks ago, we went to Rocky Point.
Ah, now you're talking. Elizabeth, you know what the swells in Newport eat at a picnic?
No.
Sea turtles and hummingbird tongues.
Hummingbird tongues. Ew.
Give me a shore dinner anytime. You get your bucket of clams, some melted butter, dish of clam broth, a couple ears of sweet corn, piece of fish. Hey, maybe even a lobster if I just got paid.
You always seem to have enough money for the beer.
Well, I need the beer to wash it down.
Next week, it's Crescent Park. And the carousel.
Wow! Oh, boy!
There's so much to do. The summer never seems long enough. The best thing about Rhode Island is that there's always been a choice. If you had money, of course, a lot of money, your summer address would probably be in Newport. Here, the wealthiest people in the United States engaged in the serious and expensive game of keeping up and getting ahead. By the turn of the century, the competition was at its peak. There was no income tax, and if your father had left you a few railroads and a bank or two, what better place to sink the money than in a French chateau or a Renaissance villa here on the bay? It was a dazzling display of domestic architecture: Ochre Court, Marble House, Belcourt Castle, and of course, the breakers. The uninitiated might call them mansions. Henry James called them white elephants. Their owners referred to them as cottages. Here, the Astors and Vanderbilts planned their next lawn parties or plotted the marriage of their daughters to European nobility. At one end of Bellevue Avenue, in a building designed by the nation's preeminent architects, McKim, Mead, and White, was the Newport Casino, a graceful structure built in what was known as the shingle style. The first lawn tennis matches in the United States had been played in Newport, and soon after the casino was built in 1880, it became the center of the tennis sporting world.
The same architects built another casino across the bay at Narragansett Pier, Newport's rival as a fashionable resort. Here, one observer remarked, there was more fun to the square inch in one day than there was at Newport for the whole season. At the Narragansett Casino, one could play tennis, baseball, bowl, cycle, or simply stroll through the grounds designed by Frederick Law Olmsted and wait for the evening concert and dance. The beaches were dotted with bathers in picturesque costumes, and in the grand hotels, there were other entertainments. Audiences in 1882 were amused and scandalized by Oscar Wilde.
For Rhode Islanders of more modest means, shoreline recreation areas and urban parks offered recreation, amusement, and escape. When Betsy Williams first offered the city of Providence a 100-acre tract of land for a park in 1871, the city felt it was too far out in the wilderness, but reluctantly accepted. Within 20 years, Roger Williams Park had become one of the finest in New England. There were sailboats and steam launches on the lakes, an artful mix of shade trees, open spaces, bridges, and smooth roadways. 4 streetcar lines converged on the park, making it accessible to everyone in Providence, And the trolley company, with an eye to public service and its own revenues, subsidized the American Band to play nightly during the summer.
Rocky Point was founded before the Civil War. For 3 decades, it attracted a genteel clientele. In 1888, it passed into the hands of Colonel Randall A. Harrington. Harrington added a dance hall and opened the place on Sundays because he believed that the typical mill worker, who labored every day except Sunday, needed some place to relax on his day off. The park soon included a theater, an observatory, games of chance, a roller coaster, and other rides, and of course, a shore dinner hall. Colonel Harrington also owned Rocky Point's chief competitor, Crescent Park, but in 1894 he leased it to one Charles I.D. Loof.
Charles Loof was a man who lived in the late 19th century. He was one of the foremost carousel makers in the country. Started out at Coney Island with the first carousel there, built this one in 1895, and this area was a resort town, really. Riverside was a resort town for Providence, served by the railroad, served by the trolley cars. They could arrive by steamboat, or they could arrive by train or trolley car. They'd spend the day on the midway, going to the carousel, the Ferris wheel. Well, this one was made by the master. So it really is one of the few left in the country, and also, fortunately for us, happens to be one of the best.
For Rhode Islanders who liked their outdoor recreation to be more energetic, there were both opportunities and examples in a number of sports. The remarkable Glenna-Colette Vare captured the U.S. Women's Amateur Golf Tournament 6 times between 1922 and 1935. In football, the 1916 Brown University team played in the first annual Rose Bowl game. In 1926, the school fielded the nationally noted Ironmen squad. Professionally, Providence was home to one of the early NFL teams, the Steamrollers, league champions in 1928. And in 1936, a determined Narragansett Indian, Tarzan Brown, drove himself to win the Boston Marathon.
But it was in baseball that Rhode Island's tradition was strongest and its contributions most notable. Providence was one of 8 cities in America with a professional baseball team. The Providence Grays joined the National League in 1878, winning the pennant twice and once going to the World Championship. During the 1920s, baseball was king, and a young pitcher named Babe Ruth passed a season in Providence on his way to immortality with the Yankees. Woonsocket produced Hall of Famers Nap Lajoie and Gabby Hartnett. Lajoie played second base for the Cleveland Indians, and his .422 batting average is still unequaled in the American League. Hartnett led the Chicago Cubs all the way to the 1938 World Series. A baseball fan is, by definition, a compiler of statistics and averages, and thus another local contribution to the record books is no small achievement. One April evening in 1981, the Pawtucket Red Sox started a game at McCoy Stadium against the Rochester Red Wings. 32 innings later, at 4 in the morning, the score remained tied at 2-2. Called at that point due to exhaustion, the game resumed 2 months later. The Paw Sox scored in the bottom of the 33rd and won the longest game in baseball history, 8 hours and 25 minutes.
I have rarely made people laugh, but I have made them dance in anger and frustration. Rhode Island is the receptacle of all sorts of riffraff and is nothing else than the sewer of New England, the home of all the scum and runaways of the country. Such twaddle. They will not understand that anyone can entertain the pernicious idea that a man should be free to think and believe as he pleases. Someday that notion will be taken for granted, but until then, it drives our critics into a fury. But I have my own fury, and I have had a long life to hone it to a fine edge. All these years of persecution and mockery have made me hate, not the persecutors, but the idea of oppression itself. The air does smell different here in Rhode Island, but it is not the stench of the sewer. It is something so rare that they cannot even recognize it. It is the air of freedom. In this remote spot, all of my hopes for peaceful coexistence with the Indians came to a fiery end one December day in 1675. We had allowed Puritan soldiers to cross into southern Rhode Island, and here they attacked and burned the winter encampment of the Narragansetts. The great swamp fight, call it by its right name. It was a slaughter of men, women, and helpless children. The great chief Metacomet, whom the English called King Philip, had watched helplessly as his ancestors' lands had been taken from him, and now he led his people in a courageous but hopeless war, destroying farms and towns up to the very outskirts of Boston. It was not Rhode Island's war, but before it was over, all of our settlements on the mainland, including Providence, were destroyed. From their physical losses, the Indians may never recover. But our spiritual wounds may be even more grave. It will always be a struggle to try to understand those who speak and act and think differently from us. But as long as this colony continues to welcome those who are distressed in conscience and persecuted for their beliefs, it is a noble struggle from which we cannot shrink. It will bring out the worst in some men. I continue to believe that it should bring out the best in all of us. For where have men enjoyed such peace, such security, such liberty of soul and body as they do here? This lively experiment must continue. It will continue.
A lively experiment was brought to you by Fleet National Bank and by your local Dodge dealer, Dodge, setting new standards of performance, and by Prego from Campbell's.